What's up everyone, welcome to this new video. So in this one, I'll be summarizing some of the concepts that were presented in the previous video regarding the emotional theory of rationality. And the goal here is to understand the relationship and the interactions between the emotional system on one end and the expectation response system on the other end. And so if you've reached this point of the bundle, you should have watched the seminar on emotional theory of rationality, and you should be able to recognize this model here. And I wanted to take some time to further describe how you can use this framework to optimize your performance and well-being. So there are actually three areas or concepts that are worth exploring in more depth: the response system, the expectation response system over here, and the emotional tension. So we're going to look at these three concepts in more details and clarify some of the unproductive strategies and more productive strategies that we can use before we start playing and when we play. So let's look at the cognitive response number one. So acting on the stimulus. Here we're talking about the response system. So finding effective response for a triggering situation, something that will inhibit the emotion and the emotional tension. So let me give you an example. Let's say you start losing. It might create anger, and maybe you feel this sentiment of injustice and entitlement. So you will look for a response to reduce the emotional tension. You're going to try to find a response that will reduce your feeling of injustice, of entitlement, your feeling of anger. And so maybe in that situation, you will start playing more aggressively to win your money back. So win the money that you might have lost a couple hands ago. And similarly, if you start winning, maybe you have a fear that if you keep playing, you might lose that money. And so maybe you decide to stop playing to book a winning session, and then reducing the emotional tension that was created by the fear of losing your profit. So here we're talking about two unproductive strategies because they don't seem to be sustainable or profitable long term. So imagine if every time you get angry or you feel the injustice and entitlement because you've lost a couple of hands, and then you try to play more aggressively to win your money back, this is not a sustainable approach or strategy. And similarly, if every time you start winning in a session, you quit your session, you won't accumulate enough volume at the end of the year to be a profitable poker player, because every time you'll start slightly winning, you're just going to end your session maybe after an hour or 30 minutes, and that's not the way we want to approach playing poker professionally. Now, let's look at more productive strategies that we can put in place for these different situations. So some situations will require us to take a productive action. So maybe we will feel overwhelmed because we play too many tables. Then maybe in those situations, there's actually a productive answer or response. Maybe we just need to reduce the amount of tables we're playing. Let's say we lose a big pot. Then maybe our strategy or response would be to focus on the execution of our skills, because that's the only thing we control in those situations. And let's say we get coolered. Well, there's not much we can do in that situation, right? Kings versus aces, not much we can do. So maybe the best response when we get this emotion coming up and this emotional tension, maybe the best response is to not respond. So to not act on the emotional tension. So the last one can be very difficult because we have learned to act and respond to our emotions. That's what emotions are there for. Like, think about it. Every time you felt an emotion and the emotional tension, we have learned that we need to act and respond to that emotion. But what we're trying to understand or learn here is that actually we can choose not to act on the emotional tension. So this is something I'd like you to keep in mind whenever you feel the anger arising, the fear, the anxiety. You don't necessarily need to act on it. And if you remember what we discussed in the past video on stress management, we talked about that sometimes we imagine a threat or a danger, and so we feel like we need to act on that threat. But what I'm telling you here is that for an imagined threat, something that you've created in your mind, there's no need to act on it. The danger is not real, so we can simply observe the emotion and the emotional tension, and we just let go of that emotion. And I remember a story about a neuropsychologist who was trying to explain this concept here of emotion and emotional tension and this feeling that we have to act on that emotion. And the tip or strategy that she gave was simply to tell yourself there's no mammoth. Because like back in the days, you'd be in the forest, you'd be in the jungle, or you'd be in the desert, whatever, and then you get face to face with an animal that might be able to kill you. And in those situations, the fear response was real, the threat was real, you need to run. But now in some of the situations, even when we play poker, the threat is not there. There's no real threat. So in those situations, remind yourself there's no mammoth, there's no bear, there's nothing that's actually putting you in danger. So keep that in mind. Cognitive response number 2. Here we're talking about acting on the reference model. So here we're talking about our expectations for a situation compared to what happens in reality. So our expectations compared to reality. So our reference model is our expectations for a situation. So as human, we create a reference model for a situation so we know what we can expect from those situations. So this is what a reference model looks like or sounds like. And so sometimes those expectations might not reflect what actually happens in reality. So I expect to win because I'm better than other players at poker. Sounds reasonable. Well, what do you know? There's a thing called variance that says otherwise. So what do we do in situations where our reference models, our expectations, might be inaccurate or are inaccurate? So two strategies or two approach that we can use is first we can try to modify the expectation. So in that situation, we're trying to accept, for example, that I will make mistakes and letting go of that expectation. So modifying the expectation to match the stimulus here, we're trying to realize that actually we're going to make mistakes. So let's adjust our expectation by understanding that we will make mistake. And when I'm saying letting go of the expectation, what does it mean actually to let go? And letting go is not necessarily letting go of the situation, because mistakes will happen, but letting go of our expectations for our situation. So we're trying to let go of the expectation so that it doesn't create a big mismatch, which allows us actually to find a response in a more calmer physical state. So instead of resisting what is, instead of resisting the situation that you've made a mistake, we are letting go, accepting that this is a situation, and then we can reframe how that situation can be useful to our growth and improvement. So that gets me to point number 2 here, reframing the situation into something useful or inspiring. So let's take, for example, let's look first at unproductive strategies, right? So if we expect that we'll never make mistakes, then for sure we're gonna get triggered every time a situation where we make a mistake in poker happens. So here the unproductive strategy is to actually have an expectation to never make mistakes, for example. Another unproductive strategy would be to expect that I should win this hand and the next hand. So this feeling of entitlement. What we realize when we play poker is that actually we don't necessarily control how much our abilities to actually win every hand. We can control or create favorable situations where we might be able to win, but we cannot control if we're going to win this hand for sure. And so having this type of expectations, again, it's going to create a mismatch, and it's going to create more emotion and emotional tensions. So talking about this idea of actually productive strategies, the first one that I've already mentioned is this idea that I will accept that I will make mistakes. That's a very good strategy, because if you accept that you're going to make mistake, no more mismatch. No more mismatch means no more emotional tension. So just feeling better, just have better feeling about yourself and your performance. And if we look at reframing the situation into something useful and inspiring, if we take something like variance, for example, so think about this. Without variance, bad players would never win. And actually, variance is what makes the game of poker profitable. So there would be no recreational players without luck. So think about this for a second, and think about your expectations towards you that should be winning every hand because you're better than other players. Think about this. So if you were to win every hand because you're better, no one would play against you. So actually here we're reframing the situation around variance. Instead of thinking of variance as something bad, we're actually thankful that variance is present, because this is what allows us to be profitable poker players. And so similarly, if you think about mistakes, without mistakes, we wouldn't learn, we wouldn't grow, we wouldn't improve on our poker game. So if we reframe the way we expect or think about mistakes, without mistakes, or if we think about mistakes, they are opportunities to learn, grow, and improve. So now, every time you make a mistake, remember that this is an opportunity for you to learn something, instead of being angry at yourself or feeling shame or guilt because you've made a mistake. So here we're reframing the situation into something useful, because we cannot change the situation. We're going to make mistakes, variance will happen, those type of things. Cognitive response number 3 here, acting on the emotional tension. So acting on the functional elements of the system, that's how they talk about it. So acting on the emotional tension here. And so let's look at some ways that we can do that. So whenever a triggering situation arises, could be because of stress, like we've seen before, or other emotions, like we're going to talk about in the next video. So we feel this emotional tension rising in our body whenever we feel stress or some sort of emotions. And in these situations, we typically have the reflex to react, right? This is something I've said already. We're going to try to find an appropriate response in order to reduce the emotional tension. But another strategies that we can put in place is manage our expectations so that it doesn't create a mismatch. No mismatch, no emotional tension. So these are basically a summary of the past 2 strategies or cognitive response we can use in our emotional system. But whenever we can't seem to find an appropriate answer, or maybe actually there are no appropriate answers other than not acting on the emotional tension, then we need something else to turn to. And so that's where strategies like increasing our activation threshold and silencing the somatic stimuli come in. And so let's look at what I mean by increasing the activation threshold. Here, it's basically to practice your ability to endure, to live with a certain level of emotional tension. So we're talking about a certain tolerance to emotional tension. Because what you'll realize is if you don't act on emotional tension, it should go away on its own. So the higher your activation threshold, the less likely you are to react impulsively to a stressful situation. What I'm trying to say here is that for people with high activation threshold, it will require a very difficult situation for you to feel like you need to respond. It will require something bigger, more impactful for you to respond, because you have an activation threshold that is higher. And everything under that threshold, you don't necessarily react, you don't necessarily feel the need or the emotional tension rising in your body. So let me give you an example. Let's say you lose an 80-20 situation, an 80-20 hand deep in a tournament. And depending on your activation threshold, some people would brush it off, simply brush it off, and other people might smash their keyboard. So two different responses to the same stimulus. So the response that you'll have in this situation is dependent on whether or not you were activated. So dependent on whether or not the situation was above your activation threshold. And so the person that brushed it off has a higher tolerance than the person who reacts to by impulsively smashing their keyboards, for example. Now let's look at silencing the somatic stimuli. Here we're talking about managing the physiological sensations. So we're talking about managing the emotional tension associated with the situation. So whenever you get tilted, you get anxious and emotions like that, how do you manage the increase in emotional tension? Do you have any strategies that comes to mind for you? And actually, there are a couple of strategies that can be useful in those situations. So let's look at some of the unproductive and then productive ways that we can actually do that. So the most common unproductive strategy I know of, and those strategies actually are strategies that work, so this is why it can be misleading. So using drugs or alcohol. So it works, but you become reliant on external agents to help you cope with the emotional tension. It has this instant effect on your emotional tension. So using drugs or alcohol as a way to decrease your emotional tension, it might help you feel calmer and more patient. So you have this instant effect when you use drugs, or typically when you use certain drugs or alcohol. So I believe, so the reason it's unproductive is it's not necessarily something that can be sustainable long term. And if I remove this crutch for you, then you have nothing else to stand by. So basically you're on your own and you no longer have any strategies in place to help you. So you absolutely rely on those strategies, which is probably, on my opinion, something that is unhelpful or can even be harmful to your general well-being and performance. So what I believe, and this is my personal opinion, is actually that the mind and the body can provide all the tools and strategies necessary to cope with difficult situations. So my belief is that you have all the tools and strategies in your body and in your mind to cope with your difficult situation. So I don't think we need external agents like drugs or alcohol to deal with those situations. And I'm going to try to provide those strategies for you so that you maybe want to try them on, or maybe that's something that you're already doing. So basically what I've realized over the years is that there are other ways to reach the same mental and physical state without having to use substances. And the best strategies I know of to help with emotional tension are meditation and breathing. So meditation can be your training tool outside the table to practice the experience of feeling the emotions and the emotional tension. So we can use meditation to practice feeling the emotions and the emotional tension. But we can really take 5, 10, 20 minutes off when playing poker to meditate. So meditation can be more a practice tool that you use as a preparation or to practice yourself outside the tables. And as for when you're in game, you're playing and you can't stop, the best tool I know of is breathing. And yes, you can use breathing techniques to manage your physical sensations and your emotional tension. And actually, this is something that we will look in more depth in the section on sensations. So meditation outside the table, breathing when playing, and the last strategies for me would be cold showers. And I'm sure there are other activities that can challenge your activation threshold, but I think cold showers is one of the best. So if we look at this here, so silencing the somatic stimuli using meditation and breathing, and increasing the activation threshold, so your tolerance, using cold showers. So let me talk about this a little bit more in depth. So what you teach yourself when you take a cold shower is that even though you get physically activated in that cold shower, and even though you feel the emotional tension increasing, right? We feel the anxiety, we feel the stress, our heart is pumping, we really want to get out of that situation. We actually can choose to stay in there. We can choose to feel the discomfort of the cold shower and not act on it. So basically we can choose to stay under this stressful situation and decide and choose not to act. And so what happens in those situations is that you train yourself not to act on the emotional tension, and you train yourself to get comfortable with that tension. So what happens is when you're under that cold shower and you feel all this muscle tension, you can train yourself to relax your body and actually understand that you're not in danger. Remember, there is no mammoth. You're not in danger. And so you can learn and practice under this stressful environment how to not react and how to live with difficult emotions and live with difficult muscle tension and emotional tension. So I think cold showers is a good place to practice this skill, and whenever you feel like you're no longer able to kind of endure the situation, you could just step back or step outside the shower. So there's no harm in that sense. So that's something that these 3 strategies actually are strategies that I've used and I'm using in my personal life, and I found a lot of benefits from those strategies, and I'm curious, maybe you have some of your own, and so feel free to reach out and share them with me, or maybe ask your friends, your poker friends, what they do to help deal with the emotional tension in their life. So let me give you a quick summary of what we just discussed in more clear, in details, but in more clear statement. A couple of examples of situations that are likely to happen over and over again in your poker career. So making a mistake, running bad, losing a big pot, booking a winning session, those are things that are likely to happen when you play. And since these challenging situations are inevitable, I highly suggest that you develop a plan for those situations. So figure out some sort of appropriate response when the situation arises, figuring out ways to reframe or manage your expectations around that situation, find strategies to help deal with or manage the emotional tension, and find ways to maybe increase your emotional threshold, your tolerance to your emotional tension. And here's an exercise that will help you with that, hopefully. And so if you go in the workbook, exercise 2.11, emotional system, here I'm training you or telling you to try to first choose a situation that triggers your emotional system. So here you might want to describe a situation that is triggering for you. So whenever I make a mistake, I get angry. So that's an example for me personally. Now I need to choose a strategy to help manage that situation. My strategy of choice is to act on the reference model. So act on my personal expectations around making mistakes. And step number 3 is to actually describe how you're going to implement this strategy to manage your expectations. So let's say you're trying to modify the expectation to match the situation. Then here where the managing the expectations would be, or modifying the expectation would be, mistakes are inevitable. So understand that I will make mistakes. that mistakes are part of my game. So that's point number one. And maybe I want to try to reframe the expectation to be something more productive in my poker game. So maybe I'm going to tell myself that mistakes are opportunity to learn and improve on my poker game. So these are ways that I can transform a difficult situation or a challenging situation into something that becomes much more manageable and helpful in general. So I will no longer see mistake as something that gets me angry. I see mistake as an opportunity to learn, improve on my game, and understanding that this is something that I cannot avoid. I will always make mistakes playing poker. So as you fill out this exercise sheet, you will also need to practice it. So practice over and over again until it becomes second nature. So until it becomes automatic that when this situation arises, you know what's the appropriate answer or response for you. And what we're doing is that we're learning new ways to deal with those difficult situations. Instead of going to our automatic impulsive reactions, maybe here we're trying to create new, more productive strategies to react to triggering situations. So hopefully this was helpful, and see you in the next video. Take care, guys.